Hello again, and welcome to In Taiwan We Speak, your audio guide to Taiwan's mind-blowing linguistic diversity. I am Alexander Shin, and today we continue our conversation about sign language and deaf education with Dr. Jean Andrews, Professor Emerita of Deaf Studies and Deaf Education at Lamar University in the U.S. Also with us here, we have Fan Huaigu, founder of the Signing Village Workshop. It's an initiative that promotes deaf-friendly solutions in tech and in education. Now, Jean, let's start with the basics. What is the deaf education, the capital D, deaf education, and what role do sign languages play in it?
Sign languages should be central in deaf education. TSL in Taiwan, ASL in the United States and Canada. So to fully educate a deaf child, they have to be educated in two languages, their sign language of their deaf community and also the written speaking language of their hearing community. To this end, we support the bilingual approach to teaching deaf children. And those who have potential to learn to speak, we call it bimodal bilingual approach.
Bimodal bilingual.
Correct. Using the two modalities, oral, vocal, and visual gestural, to teach both languages as early as possible. There is lots of controversy about this because historically, in many programs in deaf education throughout the world, the oral-only approach has been used in schools. And in fact, in many schools today, they still use oral approach, and they use maybe a little bit of sign. They take the sign language and put it in the grammar of the hearing language rather than use the deaf language. What I'm saying is that you start with the language of the deaf community. Let's go to America, American Sign Language. That is a language that it's a natural language. It's been linguistically verified and studied, and it has all the characteristics of a natural language, but it has a different structure than English, than spoken English, written English. What educators do, they promote the oral approach, but they also allow some signs in the classroom, and they take the individual ASL signs and put them in English word order, and they call that signed English.
Signed English.
Signed English. So it's a code that mixes ASL with English to approximate or to model the English grammar, all right? And this was considered, they used this for years, a signed English approach, but they found, research showed it didn't help deaf kids as much as the bilingual when they got the full ASL approach. In Taiwan, a similar thing has happened. In the schools for the deaf, they use spoken Chinese. That is the main language. That is the goal, spoken oral philosophy. But when children are having difficulty with that, they introduce some signing, and they call it sign Chinese, where they take individual TSL signs and puts them in the Chinese structure. So that's typically what's happening worldwide, really, in other countries, in the U.S., that predominantly signed English is used in the schools. It has different names, total communication, simultaneous communication. But what the research is showing that the bilingual approach with ASL as the language of instruction and then teaching English as a second language on top of that is the best approach. And then for those children who are implanted, cochlear implant or hearing aids, who benefit from the hearing technology and are showing some speech potential, the bimodal approach, where they're taught spoken language during the day, but then also they're taught the sign language, or taught through the sign language. And we have some excellent model programs in Hong Kong, Canada, and Macau for early childhood programs that are bimodal bilingual.
Well, going back to what you mentioned earlier about the signed English that you said, doesn't mean that there's a whole generation of students who grew up knowing signed English without being able to access ASL or being detached from the community that uses ASL.
It's not such a black and white thing.
Right.
It's more on a continuum. So they might be exposed to signed English by their hearing teachers, but then they go out in the community and they learn sign ASL. And so they do what we call a code switch. They go back and forth. And sometimes their signed English becomes more ASL-like. And sometimes when they're with hearing people, their signed English, their ASL becomes more English-like. So it's on a continuum.
I would imagine in Taiwan that would be a totally different thing, right? Because TSL's grammar structure is quite different from what we've learned last time from spoken Chinese grammar.
Correct. But teachers in Taiwan, I've observed in schools and of talking to former teachers like Feng Hua when he was a teacher there. And also I've done a couple studies in mainland China. I haven't been there, but I have worked with Chinese collaborators and looked at videotapes and had them analyzed. And the hearing teachers do use some kinds of signed Chinese.
I see.
And because they teach Chinese in Taiwan, they use the signed Chinese in the deaf schools.
And now within the bilingual approach that you're advocating for,
Yes.
teaching the spoken language to deaf or hard of hearing kids, how does that happen?
You're asking me to get out of my lane. You would need to talk to a speech-language pathologist who works on articulation and might use some technology to visually see spectrographs of hearing and positioning of the mouth and all of that. Every deaf child is different. Hearing loss exists on a continuum from profound to mild. Children with hard of hearing who have mild or moderate losses have higher potential because they have more residual hearing to learn speech. With the cochlear implant, they have some outcomes that children with more serious losses can learn to pronunciate some words. They're not hearing the sounds that you and I are hearing. They're hearing sounds that are more mechanical or robotic through the cochlear implant. But through lots and lots of training, a speech pathologist can work with them on speech sounds. The environments that I've worked in all my life have been with students who don't use speech at all. I mean, they might have some speech and they might talk to me sometimes, but their primary language is ASL, and that's what I teach in, and that's what they're learning in.
You've mentioned that you believe that sign language should be central to deaf education. Why is that?
Well, it's something they can use all their lives. And they use it when they get out of the school. They use it in their adulthood, and it's part of them. It's part of their deaf culture. And why delay it? Why not give them both access to spoken and native deaf sign language as early as possible? Let them choose. I've seen it happen with my own students. They receive both. When they go home and they talk to their mother, but when they're out with their deaf friends, they're using sign. With me, they use sign, and then when I'm not understanding them, they might switch over to voice to help me out because they know I'm a hearing-speaking person. They go back and forth. They code switch between the languages, and they use them both. Why are we putting these kids in an either-or? You're either oral or you're sign. That's not healthy. We need to open both avenues. And this has been supported by research in neuroscience, doing brain scans of deaf babies and deaf children. The brain does not care whether the language comes in through the eyes or through the ears. Those neural pathways are going to start developing very early. So they can become bilingual during the critical period, birth to 6. And that provides them with so much of an advantage. We also know this from studies of deaf children of deaf parents. Many of them have on grade level reading and writing skills because they've had ASL since birth. And some deaf parents are even getting their child implanted because they want them to learn some speech. But that doesn't mean they only use speech. They use speech and then they also use ASL. So to me, that is the best approach. It's not the most popular, and the people who are most against it are doctors, pediatricians, audiologists, some speech pathologists, families. Every family of a deaf child wants their child to be normal or hearing. And so it's a battle. I mean, it's a struggle. But when you talk to deaf adults, that's what they say they prefer, is to have both of those avenues open. And the research is showing good outcomes with that.
I bet this resonates with many of the conversations we've had on this show about spoken languages of Taiwan, where parents have to choose between educating their children in a language that they, their ancestral language, versus just giving in to more marketable Mandarin and English. Right? And we'll talk a little bit more about this later. Coming back to Taiwan, since 2019, Taiwan Sign Language has been recognized as a national language of Taiwan. So, Jean, from your observation, does Taiwan government live up to its declaration of making this a national language when it comes to promotion, education, and preservation of Taiwan Sign Language?
Well, let me say that Taiwan has made a big step. But as my former student, Dr. Lily Lin, says, there's still a lot of work to be done. What Yushan Ku did was extraordinary to get the government to agree to it. They didn't want to in the beginning, and they did. They have put TSL into the public school for first grade up to 12, but it's taught as a second language, as a content class. In my view, for the deaf children that are mainstreamed into the public school, they should also have opportunities to be in a bilingual class where the teacher is fluent and delivers the content in ASL. But maybe that's an experiment that needs to happen in Taiwan, and I hope that it does. My real concern is what happens with kids from birth to 6. Those are the kids that really need the TSL.
The critical period, as you said.
The critical period where the window is wide open, the brain is plastic, it's flexible. That's the best time to learn another language. And it would be wonderful if the deaf associations could get together and put together early childhood programs where they got deaf mothers to work with hearing families. Because, deaf hearing families are like 90%. Deaf children are born into hearing families, about 90%. 10% that are born into deaf families. Those 10%, they're model language teachers. So if you could get those mothers to work, and there's been some experimental studies in the U.S. already, and they've got good results. They have deaf mothers work with hearing mothers and their deaf babies and toddlers to learn basic sign language, and then they piggyback spoken language on top of that sign language that they've already built the concept. And I think that would be a wonderful development for Taiwan. The country is small. Like the U.S., it's hard to do a lot of those experimental things because we're so large and there's so many diverse school boards and school districts. But I think that would be a major expansion of the law. I don't want to criticize the law. I think it's a big first step.
But what do you think some of the challenges that the government might encounter in implementing this kind of expansion that you're saying? I know you mentioned in the previous episode the shortage of interpreters in Taiwan. What else is there?
Well, that's a big one, finding qualified personnel. One of the big barriers of keeping deaf people out of teaching or working with parent-infant programs is they might not have college degrees. And that's a barrier. And we've been able to overcome that somewhat in the U.S. by recruiting more deaf people into our bachelor's programs, in our master's programs, in our doctoral programs. We've seen a big growth in deaf teachers at the master's level and deaf PhD and doctoral level leaders in the United States. And they go in to run programs. And we've seen that's really been a major accomplishment that I've seen in my professional life. In the program that I have retired from, Dr. Diane Clark is doing an excellent job of recruiting deaf doctoral students. When Feng Hua and Lily were in the doctoral program, I think a half or 3/4 of the students were deaf. That's what Taiwan needs, a large or a critical mass of deaf people with higher degrees. The region allows them to work in these programs. So I think that's a big barrier.
Thank you so much, Jean, for your sharing. Once again, we will be waiting for you, dear listeners, next week with more. Thank you for listening.